This week is very special for the VVD International because we are going to look back on the year 2020. And we're going to do this by a series of 3 webcasts, today, on Wednesday and on Friday. And today's topic is the Belarusian protests.
The President of the Republic of Belarus, Mr. Aleksandr Lukashenko.
As you could see in this short video clip, 2020 has been a very eventful year for Belarus. We're going to talk about this with 4 very prominent guest speakers, whom I will introduce to you in a few minutes. But first, I want to invite you to participate in this event as well. You can ask questions and ask them in the comments, and please do that, because I will use those questions and ask them to our guest speakers. In the next hour, I'm first going to introduce the guest speakers, and then there will be 3 blocks. In the first part, we will look back on 2020. What were the underlying reasons for the protest? We are going to look at the election results and also at the current situation, because even yesterday, there were again very large protests. In the second block, we are going to talk about both sides of the conflict. So on the one hand, the Lukashenko regime, and on the other hand, the opposition movement. Who is supporting both sides, and how do we think that the current balance of power is going to develop? And then in the third block, we are going to look at the future. What can we expect in 2021? And of course, a very important question, what could be a potential solution? And what roles can different powers play in this in order to find a solution that is good for Belarus? Let me now move over to our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker for this session is Sven Koopmans. He is joining us from The Hague. Sven is a member of parliament for the VVD in the Netherlands. He is a spokesperson on foreign affairs. And before he became member of parliament, he had a long career in diplomacy. He was a peace negotiator for the UN in different parts of the world and in heavy conflicts like Syria, Sudan, Mali, and Kosovo. So we are very curious to hear his views on this conflict in Belarus. Sven, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ruben. Great pleasure to be here.
If you look at the events in Belarus over the last year, how would you describe them in your own words, and also if you compare them to other protests and other conflicts you have seen very closely?
Well, thank you, Ruben. Well, I see this as what would hopefully be the last dictatorship finally finding a path towards democracy. Unfortunately, we are not there yet. Not only is the dictatorship still hanging on, but also we see non-democratic movements elsewhere in Europe, so that the issue of the last dictatorship perhaps is too optimistic a label. But what we see, of course, is the power of people demanding freedom. And it is true that in Belarus, for a long time, there was some kind of economic development, but there was also stagnation. But what you cannot repress for too long is the will of people just to be free. And I can imagine looking at it from Belarus, if you are a citizen there and you have some freedoms, but you see people to the west of you in the European Union reaching towards democracy, development, things really improving. And you see on the other side, in Russia a slide towards even further dictatorship or autocracy. That there is a strong will and there is a new generation of Belarusians standing up. And I see there is a lot of energy. At the same time, geopolitically, it is difficult because this is not an area where NATO can intervene or where the EU can send an army. It doesn't have one, but even if it would, it can't do that. This needs to come from the Belarusian people. And that makes it all the more difficult for us because we see this. And there is little, though some things we can do, but we'll talk about that more, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Sven, for this introduction. And you already touched upon some of the topics that we are going to discuss more in this session. Also, as you said, the role of external powers. But as a first introduction, I'm happy to hear that you see some energy and that you're optimistic about the underlying liberal spirit that is still there and that will be difficult to contain. Thank you very much, Sven. We are now going to our second guest speaker, who is Igor Leshchenya. And Igor is joining us from Belarus. He is in Minsk. He was an ambassador of Belarus to Slovakia. And he was one of the first officials who publicly announced to support the opposition movement. And also he's a founder of the popular movement I Am Citizen. And I'm very happy that he is joining us from Minsk so he can share his underground experience. Igor, thank you for joining us. Can you maybe start with sharing a bit on what the current situation is? Because we saw the protests yesterday. How is the current atmosphere in Minsk?
I think now we entered a new phase of the protest movement, very interesting phase. From one side, it's a period of changing forms of protest. From other side, it's a very interesting period of attempts, not only of protesters, but it's a very interesting period of attempts of Belarusians to think it over, the situation, to make the assessment of the situation, to identify the new ways of moving ahead. So in any case, it's a very promising period, and in any case, protest movement is alive.
Thank you, Igor. And do you see, because the protests now have, of course, been going on for a couple of months, do you see that the support for the protest is growing, or is Lukashenko's power getting stronger, and are people maybe switching sides? What trend do you see?
Politics is the art of possibility. And the top secret of protest movement in Belarus is that at the very beginning, the leaders of this movement, they concentrated their efforts only on active protesters. They did not try to estimate, to understand how many active protesters are in Belarus. And the promising news is that now, as I understand, they are trying to work with so-called passive, silent protestive majority. So we are trying to work in depth, and it's the best basis for the future victory, for the future success of the protest movement.
Thank you very much, Igor. And we are going to talk about this further in our next session, but also in the third session. I'm very curious to hear what you see as a potential solution that could come out of these conversations between the silent opposition and the regime. Thank you, Igor. We are now going to our third guest speaker, who is Petras Auštrevičius. Petras is from Lithuania, but he is living in Brussels because he is a member of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe group. And very interestingly, he is a rapporteur for the European Parliament to Belarus. Petras, you have been watching events from Brussels, I can imagine. How do you because you are from Lithuania, what are the key differences in how people in Lithuania look at the events in Belarus and how people in Brussels are looking at it?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, VVD International, for organizing this event. It's not just, my personal experience working together with the VVD delegation in Renew Europe, which is very active in Eastern Partnership policies as well as in foreign policy of European Union and on international stage. It's a good question. I mean, how people assess differently from looking from Vilnius point of view or Brussels point of view. Indeed, I mean, we have historical ties and we have geographical proximity from Lithuania to Belarus, and we follow events, I would say, on daily basis. I mean, there are some family ties, and as I said, there is a historical affiliation, which gives us, I would say, a bit more complete picture on Belarus. We are not, I would say, so naive assessing the events, developments in Belarus. From Brussels' point of view, I have to admit that for quite a long period of time in 21st century, I mean, taking this period of time, well, Belarus was somehow erased from the political map of Europe. Well, it was a country. I mean, we had diplomatic relations, even some exchange programs, and economic cooperation was on. But if you look in real terms, I mean, to Belarus was not so much a part of European agenda. I think the European Union made very many mistakes towards Belarus, and in particular, for example, abolishing sanctions in 2016. That was completely a wrong message. I mean, to send a message to Lukashenko, who didn't change. And over the sudden, Brussels bureaucrats and experts saw enough of arguments, I mean, to change the policy line. And it gave completely wrong message to Lukashenko. So that's why I think we differently assess because of some knowledge-based, but we're united in a common approach towards Belarus.
Thank you, Petras, for these already interesting analysis and these opening words. And I'm very curious to, in the next sessions, hear more from you about the role that the EU played and should play in the future to not make the same mistakes as you mentioned about 2016. We're now moving over to our fourth guest speaker, who is Daphne Bergsma. And I'm very happy that she is joining us from Warsaw, because there were some issues with the connection until a few minutes ago. But I'm happy that she is here now. Daphne Bergsma is the Dutch ambassador to Poland and also accredited to Belarus. So she had a lot of interactions with Belarusian people. And Daphne, maybe as an opening question, you are quite close being in Warsaw and you have a lot of experience in the region. Did you see the protests coming, or were you surprised by what happened over the last year? Daphne, we can not hear your voice. Maybe you can switch on a microphone.
Now you should hear me.
We hear you perfectly.
Apologies for all the technical issues. Anyway, a very short answer to your question. No, I did not see it coming, and I do remember I organized a meeting online, of course, with experts on Belarus, 2 from Warsaw and 1 from Minsk. And this meeting was organized in July, and we were looking forward to the elections. And one of the questions was indeed about, well, and how will these elections go? What do we expect? And how long will Lukashenko continue? And none of these top experts were able to predict this. So, and I'm dealing with Belarus now for one and a half years, and for sure, I did not see it coming. No, unfortunately not. Had we been prepared for this, it might have helped the situation.
Yeah, but it's always unpredictable, of course, when protests happen.
Yes.
What do you see in Poland as the impact of this protest? Is this a topic that is discussed a lot, or is it something that is considered as not in my backyard?
Well, it is their backyard to start, first of all. It's so close, as you said. This is high on the agenda in Poland. This is high on the agenda of the present government, but this is also high on the agenda, if you might call it that way, of Polish citizens, because it very much reminds them of their own recent history, how they were able to get rid of communism. It reminds them very much of the trade union solidarity. And this is why, for everyone, people follow it closely. For people who have lived through communist times in Poland and who remember vividly how this period was ended, they are all very much interested. So yes, this is high on the agenda, and this is then indeed also translated into politics. Poland, together with Lithuania, within the EU, taking a leadership role on this issue. And you see it every day here on radio, television. It's absolutely a topical issue here.
That's very good to hear, Daphne. Thank you very much for sharing your first views. And also, of course, to our other guest speakers. I think we already touched upon many interesting points that we are going to discuss further in the next sessions, or in the next parts. And this first block that we are going to discuss now is about what happened in 2020. Because we are going to look back at what happened in the last year. Why did the protest occur? What were the underlying reasons? And also, what was the impact of the elections? Because, of course, these results, they caused a lot of issues in Belarus. So what were the effects of these election outcomes? And also, how should we look at the ongoing protests? Because they have been taking place now over the last couple of months. Even yesterday, there were again large protests. So how should we look at this current situation? As you could see in this short video clip, the protests have been quite large and also very intense, and there has been quite some violence taking place. And I'm wondering how our guest speakers consider these events. And we are going to discuss this in this first block in pairs. First, we have Daphne and Sven joining us. Daphne, let me start with you, because you said that it was quite a surprise that these protests were so big and were so intense. What do you see as the main underlying reasons for the protest on this scale?
Well, if you look, I mean, of course, first of all, there were the elections, and the fact that there was this huge support, apparently, the government said, for the president, that he was re-elected. This was something people simply did not believe. People did not believe, what was it, that he won the elections with 80% of the votes. They knew it was absolutely not true. So that was the actual trigger on the day. But if you look in, and it's easier said now when we can look backwards, but what you could see in the months coming up to the elections was that people were getting more and more tired of the socio-economic situation. Things were not improving, the economic situation was diminishing, and of course, there was also COVID. I personally believe that COVID and the way Lukashenko dealt with this was also something that people thought, this is nonsense. We all have seen the pictures of Lukashenko driving a tractor, saying, well, all we should do is go to the sauna, drink enough vodka, and it's not really a threat. And this, Belarusian people are not stupid. So simply this was something they did not believe, and they did not feel they were taken seriously. And I think this combination, socio-economic, no changes, no progress in society, the way COVID was dealt, and then the fact that on the day of the elections, the results were simply stolen by Lukashenko and saying that he won 80% of the votes. No one absolutely believed that.
Sven, thank you, Daphne. Sven, you have seen protests in different parts of the world and also, of course, watched events in Belarus closely. Do you also see this as the key reasons for the protest, or do you see other reasons and maybe some similarities with comparable protests that have been taking place over the world?
Well, of course, I wouldn't dare to disagree with the ambassador. But perhaps I could add to that. One thing is that, of course, there is now a generation in Belarus that grew up with Lukashenko always there. And they see, looking just over the border, that freedom is possible. And they see, looking over the other borders, that a further slide to autocracy is also possible. So I would add that as a factor. Just the desire of young people, particularly, to be free. And then all the reasons the ambassador mentioned, the virus, the way Lukashenko dealt with it, the economic stagnation, yes. Thinking of other countries where you saw similar protests, I think economic stagnation, just the sense that young people have that there is no job for them, or that perhaps slightly older people, that, well, there is no way out for them. That contributes a lot. I've seen that in Sudan. We see that in many countries around Russia, that at some point the continuing economic stagnation, the slide backwards, pushes people to stand up. And if then you see that the politicians are just not taking you seriously, they're making a joke of it all, then you can get so angry at some point that you rise up. We see that in so many countries around Russia. And for that reason also, I believe Russia is so anxious about what's happening in Belarus. And sadly, that means that from Moscow now, the pressure on Minsk is increasing.
And maybe to follow up on that, because you mentioned some protests in other parts of the world. We have also seen, for example, in the Arab world, that when protests take place for a longer time and no real change is happening, then they can fade out over time and the dictatorship can stay in place. Do you also see this happening now if you look at the current situation in Belarus, or is there still enough momentum for change?
Well, I think back of a visit I had with actually VVD International last year to Algeria, where you had a protest erupting in perhaps a somewhat similar fashion. And there they made the wise choice, the protesters, from their point of view, of course, to channel the protests, to have them on a weekly basis, so that you don't require everyone to keep on protesting all the time, as we've seen in say, Syria and in Egypt and in other countries, but to dose it, to have it on Fridays, or in Belarus on Sundays. I think that is wise from the demonstrators' point of view, because then people can still lead their life, but you have a very focused point of pressure. I can't say that I have seen this breakthrough, perhaps with Sudan as an exception, but it is, I guess, the best way in the long run to maintain the momentum and to maintain the energy, and not ask everybody to drop everything or start a violent protest. This is, I think, the peaceful way that has better chances of success. Though I can't give you too many examples of success, I think it needs to come from many directions.
Daphne, I see you nodding. Does it mean you agree with Sven's analysis?
Yes, I do. And especially also what Sven is saying on it has to come from the people. You know, there is always the question, should it come from outside? Should it come from inside? Well, there should be a combination both from the outside pressure and inside. But in the end, it's up to the people of Belarus to continue the protest. And you see now that they are changing their tactics also a bit. Indeed, there is every Sunday there are still protests. But what we've seen yesterday, I think it was in more than 120 different places that there were protesting. So because also when you see that the authorities, the security, the police are getting tougher and tougher, it's maybe better not to have everything concentrated in Minsk and all the people together, but spread it out all over the country. And what I find amazing is that people still protest, you know. It is something in knowing that so many people are in prison, are in jails, that so many people get beaten up, that you still have the courage to go out on the street. I find this amazing, and I absolutely admire this.
Amazing spirit. Thank you, Daphne. Let me move over to our other two guest speakers, Petras and Igor. Igor, maybe first question to you, because we just heard that there is still a lot of spirit and that the protests are not only in Minsk, but also in different parts of the country. If you look back on last year, building up to this point, what do you see as the key moments over the last year that were very important for the opposition movement to gain more support and momentum?
The main idea, maybe the main result, if it's possible, this year we witnessed that Belarusians are becoming adult nations, and they are becoming adult nations, namely in the form of civil society. So it's very interesting phenomenon. And I'd like to single out, I'd like to try to continue, maybe to summarize the opinion of my predecessors. In reality, it's really possible to single out 4 triggers for these situations. First was really attitude from the side of authority towards COVID-19. Second was a very dirty electoral campaign, when people identifying new, very interesting faces as potential alternative candidates for presidency. Third, of course, very strange official result received by Mr. Lukashenko. And fourth, of course, this unprecedented for Belarus violence in the streets. So these 4 triggers, they led to this situation, and the uniqueness of the situation is that we witness a really mass movement without definite leaders. I think maybe first time in the course of the last 26 years, people demanded their elementary civil and political rights. So it's a really very unique situation. So if summarize.
4 very clear points, also building on what the previous speakers have said. Thank you very much for that. Petras, I would like to move over to you and use some of the questions that the audience asked in the meantime, because a lot of questions are coming in. And of course, thank you very much for all the participants to bringing those up. We have talked about the events in Belarus over the last year, and you already said something in your introduction about the role of the EU. If you look back on the last year, how do you consider what the EU has done? Was that effective, or was it more obstructive, so to say?
I mean, to start with, you know, we have to understand the, let's say, the whole process of Lukashenko being in power. I mean, he is in power since 1994. In EU, it was Santer's commission. Sweden and Finland completed accession negotiations. It's almost ages ago, and Lukashenko is still in power. You know, he's still in power, doing whatever he wants. He is a very bossy leader of the country. I mean, he can't be probably even called the president, because president is accountable to people. I mean, he is accountable to only to his closest entourage and kind of post-Soviet nomenclatura. But with this in mind, I can tell you that I noticed, I mean, quite a dramatic shift in the position of the European Union towards Belarus. Finally, very finally, the European Union, as a part of the Western position, was really serious in making some statements, defining its position, and so on and so forth. It wasn't easy. It wasn't automatic, I have to admit, because beforehand, I mean, for years, we've been simply toothless in what comes to Lukashenko. And believe me, the European Parliament, in the course starting from September, we adopted a report on Belarus, and we had 2 resolutions. It shows that, I mean, the political attention and appetite to deal with the events in Belarus is much higher, because we do understand probably the complexity of events which are going on in Belarus. But I always define our position by 3 S: solidarity, support, and sanctions. So we are very in solidarity. We started to provide, finally, some support. But on sanctions, I think we didn't finish yet the kind of all instrumentarium we might have as an impact on Lukashenko's regime.
Thank you, Petras. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because that might be part of a solution in the future, of course, and we're going to discuss this more in part 3 of this session. I would like to ask all of our guest speakers to join, because we have a few more questions from the audience. And one question that is coming up is that we have seen that a lot of protesters and leaders of the opposition were forced to move abroad. And people are wondering, can they still support the protest movement from outside of Belarus? Or as a result of that, is the opposition becoming less effective? Maybe Igor, you can say something about that.
Thank you. First, it's a very important tactical success achieved by Mr. Lukashenko. When he pushed Svetlana Tikhonovskaya to Lithuania, when he pushed Mr. Latushka to Poland, he created a very familiar ideological framework for Russia. So there are images of great Lithuanian Duke of Lithuania, Poland, and Belarus. Our Russian partners, they found themselves in very familiar framework of uneasy ties with the European Union. So as it concerns to our neighbors, there is a joke in Belarus. The neighbor is almost a member of the family. So we have 2 very big, very beloved members of the family, the European Union and Russia. And of course, when we speak about the European Union, we are able to single out Poland and Lithuania as very separate, very independent, very important members of the family. As for the opposition leaders in abroad, of course, being in abroad influences persons. They are able to speak such things that I'm unable to speak here. Mm-hmm. And I used to explain that I have 2 points. I'm in online either being 1 kilometer from headquarters of the residence of Mr. Lukashenko, or either being 3 kilometers from the place of detentions of Maria Kolesnikova. So everything is very nearby. But in any case, we have a lot of members of consultative council, coordination council here in Minsk. And of course, many politicians, they try to do their best to find solutions. I should state that all political parties that are not created by the government, all political forces, they share the same values which are embodied by coordinative council. And
Igor, thank you very much for mentioning this, because this is the topic we are going to talk about in our next session. We are going to talk about the opposition movement, and I'm very curious to hear more from you about this. So thank you very much. Also to our other guest speakers for this first part, and we are now moving over to the second part. And in this second part, which Igor already mentioned, we are going to talk more about both sides of the conflict. On the one hand, the Lukashenko regime. Why is it able to stay in power? Who is supporting the current regime? And on the other hand, the opposition movement. What are the different subgroups within this movement? And is it strong enough to be a true alternative to the Lukashenko regime? And what was also already mentioned in our previous round is what role can external powers play in how this current balance of power is going to develop.
3 women have spearheaded the Belarus opposition campaign. Their triptych of icons, the peace sign, a heart shape and a clenched fist.
Aleksandr Lukashenko went on TV yesterday several times, and he said that he hadn't left the country, that he is alive, contrary to some of the rumors that had been circulating earlier in the week. And he also didn't look like he was willing to go anywhere.
And we're going to talk about this second topic with each of our guest speakers individually. And I would like to start with Igor, because Igor, a few moments ago, I was interrupting you, not because it was not interesting what you were saying, but because it's exactly what we want to talk about now in this section. Igor, when you look at the opposition, what do you see as the key subgroups? And do you think that they are unified enough and strong enough to be a true alternative for the Lukashenko regime?
In reality, now, as I mentioned, almost all Belarusian politicians, all political parties, all civil organizations, which were not created by the government, they share the same values. And moreover, I think it's possible to state that these three goals, 3 values, new election, releasing the political prisoners, investigation of crimes, I think it's possible to state that these are 3 demands of the people, not only coordination council. And I think there are prerequisites for some mutual understanding between all these political forces. At least I'm able to state that I established so-called diplomatic relations with all more or less with all significant players, both abroad and inside Belarus. I think there is no one magnificent recipe to solve these problems. We should follow several parallel ways, and all of these to enforce each other. What do I mean? Peaceful protests, attempts for strikes, activities of legal organization, activities of the legal organization of civil society. All these 3 trends, 3 directions they should enforce each other. Thus I'm sure that we should use all possibilities, and I see the potential, the prerequisites for uniting forces and for coordination of all representatives of civil society and of all representatives of protests.
Thank you, Igor. And I think it's very clear that all elements must be in line, and it's great that you personally can also play an important coordinating role in this. I would like to move over to Sven. Sven, one thing that we haven't discussed as deeply as so far is the role of Russia. Can you maybe say a few words on how you see the role of Russia in this conflict, and how are they keeping Lukashenko in power?
Well, it's an alarming role. Of course, Russia has a great interest in keeping Belarus in its sphere of interest, sphere of control. And I say Russia, but of course I mean President Putin. He is concerned after what happened in so many countries around him, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Armenia, that there will be another revolution that topples one of his associates, and that will be a source of inspiration for his own people in Russia. Now, how is Russia supporting Belarus? Well, in part by what it doesn't do. Actually, it has these subsidized transfers of gas and other materials towards Belarus that it is not necessarily revoking, but of course it's threatening to do that if the Minsk government doesn't do what it wants. At the same time, Russia has, and sadly so, a very credible military threat that it doesn't need to push over by invading the country with tanks and so on, as we've seen in the distant past in the Czech Republic and so, but it can just pop up, as we have seen in Crimea, as we have seen elsewhere. And that is a serious threat, and it is a threat, of course, mainly to the protesters, but in a way it's also a threat to Lukashenko and his people, because they don't want to lose the control either to the protesters or to Putin.
Thank you, Sven, for your clear analysis on the role of Russia. With an eye on time, I'm moving forward to Petras. Petras, you said before something about the role of the EU. Do you think that the EU is key to keep the opposition movement strong, or do you think that there is also an adverse effect if the EU is announcing their support too strongly?
You know, the protests are already for 140 days. To sustain a morality organization, I mean, to motivate people come on the streets, it's not an easy task. So that's why, generally speaking, our attention, our solidarity with Belarusian people, with the goals they are raising against them for a country, for country's future, is so important. For me, it's secondary. I mean, can we support them financially? Yes, of course, we have to support them financially, because some people are beaten, tortured. There are some simply healthcare expenses which might be and should be probably shared by the EU side. And generally speaking, support to the civil society, independent media, journalists, and trade unions who, again, I mean, went on the general strike for some time and hopefully will come up again. So they all need the support. But political attention, this kind of the moral standpoint of the European Union, democratic community worldwide, I think it's of the primary importance to Belarusians who are looking forward, I mean, indeed, for this kind of solidarity-based approach, as well as, by the way, the opposition support from Russia, which is again important, because I think we might see very similar events in Russia, like now in Belarus. So that's why it's a very bad message to Mr. Putin. All those events and weakened to a certain point Lukashenko, it's absolutely strategically negative message to Putin.
Thank you, Petras. Very clear recommendation for the EU. Thanks. Thank you very much for that. Finally, I would like to go to Daphne. Daphne, you're an ambassador for the Netherlands. We talked about the role of big powers like Russia and the EU. For an individual country like the Netherlands, what can a country like the Netherlands do to support the opposition or to help with finding a solution?
One of the reasons that we do have an embassy office in Minsk, for instance, because, well, I am here in Warsaw, but I do have one diplomat in Minsk. And one of the reasons for having that embassy office has been for the Netherlands to support civil society. We have this office only since about 4 years, but actually, and this is not what everyone in the Netherlands knows, but for 20 years, the Netherlands has been supporting financially civil society in Belarus. And of course, we have never been very open and very vocal about that. You know, it doesn't make sense to tell you exactly who we are supporting and give telephone numbers, etc. That doesn't work in Belarus. But we have been supporting civil society for 20 years. And actually, we are among the very few countries present in Minsk who have such a record for so many years. So yes, we are a small country, the Netherlands. But since our foreign policy has always been focusing on the values of democracy, rule of law, human rights, this is what we can do in Minsk. And we have been doing it, yes, so we can make a difference. I'm not saying that we are going to be the game changer, not at all, but we can do so. And I think it was Igor who was also saying moral support. That is also something we can do nowadays, but we continue with our support of civil society. And then, of course, in the Netherlands, both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have received Mrs. Tikhonovskaya. And I think that was a very successful visit. So yes, we can do things, but we cannot be the game changer. That's for sure.
Thank you, Daphne. At least it's great to hear that as a small country we can make a difference. Not maybe the difference, but a difference. That's great to hear. Thank you very much to each of our guest speakers for sharing your views on this topic. We are now moving over to our third and final block. And in this final part of the event, we are going to look at the future. What can we expect to happen in 2021? And also, I would like to hear from our guest speakers what a potential solution could be. And also, of course, hear view from other people listening and watching this session. How can we find a solution? And what role can external powers play in order to find this solution?
Can you see a viable route for Svetlana Tikhonovskaya, an opposition figure, to get back into Belarus, though? Because at the moment she's having to live in exile.
She is forced out in very brutal circumstances.
The people of Belarus want change, and they want it now. And we are impressed by the courage of the people of Belarus.
Our message is very clear. Stop the violence.
Le sanctionner, c'est en quelque sorte justifier un refus de continuer à discuter.
The EU has strongly condemned the death of a Belarusian artist and government opponent who died after he was arrested in the capital Minsk. Amnesty International has called for an investigation and an end to what it describes as a reign of terror.
The European Union stands ready to mobilize all its economic means to support and accompany democratic change.
In the last part of this session, we're going to look for a solution because we all want these horrible images of violent protest and violent crackdowns to end. And I will first ask to Petras and Sven. We already talked a bit about the role of the EU, but in these last 10 minutes, can you very concisely say what you see as the key ingredients for a solution and what the EU should do in order to implement those ingredients? Maybe Petras, do you want to start?
Sure, why not? Thank you. as I said before, I suggest the EU policy line is based on solidarity, support, and sanctions. And we have to insist on a national dialogue, which is the key point of the opposition. Let's talk. They invited Lukashenko for a kind of national dialogue, which must decide, the future arrangements, political arrangements for this transitional period. So that's why mediation effort from the European Union must continue. We have to continuously call on Belarus to engage with the opposition, and probably even knowing that Belarus is not replying to any request from OSCE or even Council of Europe, but probably Council of Europe might be the good offices offering institution which might invite Belarus, because Russia is in the Council of Europe. It's more comfortable institution for Lukashenko to choose. So that's why mediation and national dialogue, it's something what should continue. And finally, we have to support political parties network in Belarus. Something new. Not all old-based political parties, but these new ones based on a kind of absolutely new civic society movement.
Thank you, Petras. Sven, there are questions from the audience coming in from people who are very interested in your background, because, as I mentioned in the beginning, you've been a peace negotiator for a long time, and people are asking for your personal advice. So, with your experience, what advice would you give to the EU in this negotiation that should happen?
Well, thank you. Well, Petras actually already gave the beginning of what I would say, the national dialogue. You need to have everyone around the table. Or maybe, in my experience, actually you don't want them around the table because they will hate each other. You may have them in separate rooms, but you need to start the conversation. And then I would say you look at changing the constitution. Because, of course, now the constitution is outdated. And this is something that Lukashenko has himself actually also mentioned. And so you could say, well, sir, we take you up on your offer. Let's sit down and deal with it. Eventually, you move towards elections. That's where the EU, but also the OSCE and many others can help. But one very important thing I have learned from my experience in peace negotiations everywhere is that, of course, looking at from the outside, as I would now do, I would look at the nice principles, democracy, rule of law, and so on, and we want a good future for the country. But really, everyone who sits around the table or in the separate rooms is also thinking about their own position. So one thing we should not forget is offering Lukashenko a way out. It doesn't help if we say, you have to sign this, and then we drag you off to jail. We will be able to find a solution only if everybody cooperates. And that means we also need to think of a way that he can save face. Now, it is sad, it is tough, but as a peace negotiator, having seen this in many places, you have to think about those people who need to sign the document. Yeah. What will make them sign?
Yeah. Thank you, Sven. I think that's very useful advice in order to come to a solution which is bearable for both sides. Let me go to Daphne and Igor. Daphne, when we think about a solution, as Sven is saying, in which there is a way out also for the Lukashenko regime, how do you think that such a solution what the elements of such a solution can be? That there is still a way out for Lukashenko.
You started this round of the discussion also by what you are expecting and what we are hoping. Here I would emphasize what I'm hoping. What I'm expecting, I simply do not know, because I think also in this part of the discussion, there is one country, one power we have to mention, and that is Russia and Putin. National dialogue, yes, but I think that there is no national dialogue going to take place if Putin does not agree to that. Way out for people, I again find that difficult to say, because this is what the Belarusian people themselves will have to say. they will have to come to a conclusion. What will be the way out for Lukashenko? Will there be a way out? I find that very difficult to say. You already here start in, like, I think it was Sven who said we start talking about changing the constitution. You already hear that there are people in the opposition that are saying we should first have elections, because only with the newly elected people in government does it make sense to start talking about changing the constitution. I find it very, very difficult again to say what I am expecting, what would be the ideal solution, because unfortunately, and I think this is also what Sven has indicated, there is no guidelines, there is no booklet saying step 1, step 2, step 3. But it all comes down to what the opposition themselves, how they would like to solve the situation. But again, it's not only one, there is always the elephant in the room, it's Putin. If Putin is not going to give room for anything to change, nothing is going to happen, I'm afraid.
Clear. Thank you, Daphne, for your analysis. Maybe Igor, finally, a lot of people from the audience are asking what is going to happen in 2021. Of course, as the other speakers were saying, it's very hard to make predictions. But since you are underground and experiencing everything on a daily basis, can you maybe share a little bit about what you expect to happen in 2021?
The best solutions for our crisis may be talks under the auspices of the EU and Russia. Personally, I launched a so-called compromise plan embodied in so-called transitional referendum on issues of new elections and on 2 principal models of constitutions. In any case, now the EU and Russia, they are inevitable players in our national dialogue, nationwide dialogue. All other ways, they may be more or less bloody, to wait for the exhausting the economy, to wait for the sanctions. I don't think that is the best solution. So I really hope that we will find forces, that we will find possibilities to find the so-called middle way, the way to take aside all bloody solutions, to take aside new possibilities of new victims and new tortures. In any case, after 1 year, when we will meet 2022, I think we will hear congratulations from a new person. The name of this person will not be Mr. Lukashenko.
Thank you, Igor. I think that's very clear, both realistic and optimistic at the same time. We have a few more minutes left, and I would like all our guest speakers to join, because we have in our audience, we have liberals joining from different countries and different parts of the world. And in these difficult times, especially in Belarus, but also in other countries, people are looking for a message of hope. So let's try to end in an optimistic way. And let me ask you just to, in one sentence, say something optimistic to either the protesters in Belarus or to liberals watching from their homes all around the world on this topic. Maybe, Petras, I can start with you, just in one sentence.
Well, thank you. Thank you once again for having me at this exchange. Well, I believe as a liberal, I'm very much inspired by civic protests in Belarus. I mean, Lukashenko was able to create a police state, but he will not create a prison state. So that's why Belarusian nation, a proud European nation, will win. And it will be led by liberal ideals like democracy, rule of law, and basic freedom. So, Żyje Belarus.
Thank you. I think that's a great call. Daphne, do you want to add on to that?
Yes. What I would like to say is that I am very proud of the women in Belarus, because here what we have seen, we saw these pictures of 3 women, 3 leaders of the opposition, Svetlana Tikhonovskaya, who kept on saying in the beginning, well, I'm only a teacher of English, I'm only a housewife, and look what she's doing now. So I absolutely want to pay my respect to the women of Belarus who've stood up against Lukashenko and still have the power to continue to do so.
Thank you, Daphne. I think that's very important to mention as something very special indeed in this conflict, the role of women. Sven, what would you like to give us as a final message of hope and optimism?
Well, last year I was supposed to go to Belarus with Parliament, and I actually got this tour guide. Where is the camera?
Yeah.
There it is. With what is happening and with this discussion, I have good hope that I'll get to use this in a free Belarus sometime soon.
That would be great. We're all looking forward to that. And then finally, Igor, you already mentioned some optimistic things, but some final message of hope. Please share it with us.
Historically, Belarusians were distinguished by tolerance and first. The second idea, this year we witnessed the birth of a real of Belarusian nations as civil society. Thus, we have all preconditions, some preconditions for liberal democracy in Belarus. We have preconditions for realizing the slogan "Живе Belarus."
Thank you, Igor. I think that those words are, I think everyone understands them, although it's not our native language. And I think those are great to end this session and this conversation. Normally, of course, we would end with a big applause from the audience. I'm sure it will happen now, but in a virtual way, so people can applaud from their homes. I think it's been a great session. It was great to hear your views, both on what happened this year and also your ideas on how a solution could look like. So thank you very much for joining us and making this event very great and interesting. And of course, it's very unfortunate that it's 5 o'clock now and that we need to end this session. But I have some good news, because there are 2 more sessions coming up this week. On Wednesday, we will talk about Lebanon. And on Friday, we will talk about US foreign policy. Same time, same channel. Looking forward to seeing you again. Have a nice day.